I'm Kathy Wagenish, by the way, president of the local branch of AAUW. And we sent out a April Fool for our newsletter that said that today's meeting was going to be Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about demonstrating hate speech. Anyway, happy to see you all here. For those of you who don't know about AAUW or might like to be interested in joining us, there are a bunch of us here, but in particular there's one sitting back there in a red shirt and a mask. Wave, Norma. This is our membership chairman, Norma. And she has in her hand some of the things that we do every year, which is a Shape the Future campaign to attract new members, and during this limited time period, its membership is half price. So if you're interested, see Norma after the meeting. And now, Chuck, it's to you.
Hi. Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon. A lot going on. Anyway, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, which is really pleased to co-sponsor this meeting with AAUW. It's a great team up, and we've done it a number of times, and we'll do it even more in the future, I expect. A couple of upcoming events. One is in 2 weeks, Reggie Harris, who's years and years and years of storytelling and folk singing and the like, will be here at 2 o'clock on Saturday, Sunday the 16th. And what Reggie's going to do is a program about his family. And Reggie is black, and he's going to talk about having met his white cousins and his tracing himself back to a Confederate Civil War general and all of that kind of stuff, and with songs and other kinds of things. But it'll be an exciting program, and Reggie is always worth hearing. There is a ticket price, and we'll be announcing that, but it will be an exciting program. And then in 4 weeks, Jack Rossiter Munley, who works for a local refugee settlement organization in Bennington, will talk about how the community can help individuals who are relocating to Bennington. Some are already here, more are coming, and what this means for them, for us, and it's really exciting. So look forward to, we'll be promoting that as well. This program is made possible by the Vermont Council on the Humanities, or Vermont Humanities Council, it changed its name a couple of years ago. Vermont Humanities Council, under its Speakers Bureau. So our speaker is being underwritten largely by the council. The council is a not-for-profit statewide organization that is focused on getting people involved in talking about and exploring the humanities, history and the like. And that includes their First Wednesday programs, their Speakers Bureau. They do adult literacy programming and a host of other things. So take a look at their website if you're so inclined. It's an exciting organization. And towards the end of at the end of the session, or whenever you like, Sheila Molyneux has some survey forms for if you want to give feedback on this program. So it's my pleasure to reintroduce Meg Mott, who was here in January, slightly colder weather. Meg, for 20 years, taught undergraduates at Marlborough College, and in the areas of political theory and constitutional law, or something like that. She's also politically active in her hometown of Putney, where I think she's moderator at the town meeting. Always an exciting chance to be engaged. And she is really focused, so much of her work is focused on the Constitution, how it operates, and, excuse me. So it's a real pleasure to have Meg with us again, and we'll probably do it again and again, just because she is so energetic and exciting. Meg Mott.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate the introduction. That's quite a good memory because there were no notes. That was reminding, you had to remember what I taught at Marlboro. You had to remember there was a Marlboro. It takes a lot. We have to hold in our brains right now. And also thank you to Kathy and the AAUW. Really appreciate this opportunity to come back to Bennington. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. So as Chuck said, I am quite possessed by the Constitution. I like it that we have a system of government that doesn't give us all the answers, that sets some ideas out for us, and then we disagree. And it has always been that way. When I came here in January, it was about all the disagreements at the beginning of the Constitution, and is the document that we're operating under a good document, or does it need to get amended, and how hard it is to be amended. And at the end of the conversation, I talked about an effort to amend the Constitution and some pretty exciting proposals that are out there. There's also the Equal Rights Amendment, which has still been, Kathy reminded me, 100 years ago, coming up any day now, that the ERA was first proposed. Still in the oven, folks. I don't know what's going to happen. But that, yes, we do have this Constitution. Yes, it's hard to amend. And I kind of like it that it doesn't tell us clearly what to do. Even though it would be easier if it did. And I couldn't help but notice that you have some pretty great things on the wall. One of them is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Yeah, I can't read it quite from this angle. A free and responsible search. That's a nice word, free. So one of the things we'll be talking about today is this right that we had through the First Amendment, the right to free speech. What is its purpose? How does it get us into trouble? How it makes us very angry at one another? How it also says Congress cannot make any laws abridging the freedom of speech, which sometimes you might want. Although I noticed somebody's got a great sweatshirt over there, defund the thought police. Yeah, Congress cannot do that. And then I did bring with me my Vermont Constitution because I think it's also important in this state where we do have strong constitutional protections for free speech and free assembly, which is oftentimes where people say very nasty things in our public assemblies. So it's a problem, and we got to come up with a solution, and I'm hoping by the end of this talk you feel energized like, okay, freedom is good. Hate speech is a problem, but we can't criminalize it. So what do we do in between those two spaces? A great thing to think about on a Sunday afternoon. So let's start with, I'll give you just sort of a brief sort of sense of what's going to go on. First of all, I'm really curious to find out what you all think the purpose of free speech is. Because there it is in the Constitution, but what's the purpose? Why do we need it? How is it useful to us? And then I'm curious what you all think of what is the purpose of hate speech. Again, this is like, you may say one is great and the other's not so great, but freedom is one of those words, especially if we're going for meaning and truth, where people may feel like there's very different answers, and when they start to feel their opponent is evil, they say hateful things. Or they want to control a certain group and make sure they don't participate, so they say hateful things. So I'm just wanting to, like, before we get into the weeds of of what this means on a constitutional level, just to kind of get a sense from you all. What do you think the purpose of free speech is? What do you think the purpose of hate speech is? And then I want to look at a Supreme Court case, and I'm not doing PowerPoint today. I brought something you can take home with you. It's about a very specific case from the 90s where the city of St. Paul passed an ordinance in an effort to reduce hate speech. And then what happened when it went to the Supreme Court. So it's good to know this case and understand how the justices thought about this issue, just because it's part of the lay of the land. Because we don't have a rule book telling us what to do all the time. But we do have a Supreme Court who gives us arguments for how we might think about this, and then we either listen to them or we don't. Because the Supreme Court is not a priestly class under a theocracy. They are a very important institution. I'm a big fan of the Supreme Court. They are a very wonderful institution to teach us how to engage in constitutional reasoning. Because you may not agree with their opinions, but you can always count on a justice to lay out their arguments and explain their reasoning and to tie it to the somewhat vague language in the Constitution. So they show us how to do that. But then it goes back to the people, and we have to live these lives and figure it out. So once we've gone over the Supreme Court case, then I want to bring it a little closer to home, which is, it's harder and harder to have a public meeting. Seems like people are getting pretty angry. Hateful things being said in public meetings. So if we can't ban disrespect, that's what our Constitution tells us. We cannot ban disrespect. We cannot ban hate. How do we hold public meetings, and how do we actually solve some of our problems given the freedoms that we have? So I always like to end on a high note, and I think I've got a high note on this one, a happy note, but that's going to be sort of how we look through this whole thing. Okay, so let's get started. What do you think is the purpose of free speech? So I can write it on my board here. And because this is being filmed, I will try and restate what people say, but I'm also going to write it down over there, so I may be moving back and forth quickly. What do you think? What is the purpose of free speech? Yes, and can you tell me your name?
Gary.
Gary.
To express my ideas or opinions. But I do that verbally and out loud to try to get other people to change their ideas and opinions.
Oh. Gary says to express my ideas and opinions, and then elaborates by saying in order to persuade others. So Gary, are you feeling pretty secure about your opinions?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah, so you're feeling secure about your opinions, and you have free speech, so you can try and get other people to finally...
That's the only way the reason why I would want to vocalize it is to change them, because I'm already secure where I am.
Got it.
So I'm trying to change his mind or her mind.
Yes.
To go along with me.
So Gary is I so appreciate your honesty. The only reason you would risk saying what your opinion is because you need these other people, idiots, to finally get wise about what's going on. Exactly. And that's why we have free speech, in order to deal with the idiots. Yeah, thank you. And can I get yours?
Sure, tortoise.
Tortoise.
It's so we can hear varied positions.
Oh, here. Various positions. So Tortoise, you feel like it's you want to, unlike Gary, maybe you could talk to Gary after the show, but it's really important to have free speech, because otherwise you wouldn't hear these different points of view.
Correct.
And you really want to hear them.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and could you tell me your name?
Clark.
Clark.
Free and open exchange of ideas and thought.
And you're saying that, Clark, free and open exchange of ideas and thought, and you use that beautiful word free. Why is that important to you?
It's important to me because basically by having the freedom to speak one's mind, it represents respect for the individual ability to think through and develop positions and ideas on the subject at hand.
And what I hear you saying, Clark, is that if it's not really open, which is why maybe the defund the thought police, if it's not really open, you're not showing respect for other people. Because you gotta have a lot of different viewpoints out there in order to, because respect shouldn't be easy, right? It's usually a little hard. It's like, I don't really want to respect that, but they're saying it, so I'm going to go through that. Yeah, and then that's a key piece of free speech. And I forgot your name from last time. Is it what?
Jill.
Jill. My fingers remembered the J. Jill, okay.
It's an easy one.
Yeah.
Mhm. I would say also to speak without fear of recrimination or imprisonment.
Jill said how important it is to be able to speak without fear, and really, imprisonment is big. So many places, we may complain about the United States. Hey, it's kind of our right to complain about the United States, but a lot of places you end up in jail or worse, or having worse in jail. Yeah. Chuck, you had your hand up.
I think one of the things it does is it allows people to make money by publishing anything they think people will buy or broadcast. So it makes it possible for Fox to lie and earn lots of money doing it.
And we know money is speech.
So I wrote down, Chuck, media industrial complex. But this idea that, what do we have? Okay, so, and Chuck, I like that you're smiling as you're saying this, because it's a cynical answer, isn't it? And yet people are like, oh yeah, we know what you mean. So the free speech is a good business model, because if you say super outrageous things, and it has, I don't want to say right now, because American history has got people saying outrageous things even before social media. But that is a good business model. I have to put a little asterisk on that because it is a little bit of an outlier with all the other answers to the question, which is about freedom, learning, hearing. But it's definitely part of the landscape, yeah. And you, sir?
So I'm going to give another utilitarian answer here because particularly as I get older, my time becomes more limited. And
Yeah.
people speaking freely allows me to determine where to put my resources. If I don't agree with what they're saying and don't think I can change their mind, I'll spend my time elsewhere.
Right, and do you mind telling me your name?
Tom.
Tom. So Tom gave a utilitarian answer saying that it's really useful to hear what these different points of view are, because then Tom can make a decision where to spend your resources. So I'm going to put that down as discernment. And that process of discernment is super important. Okay, I've got a few hands up, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. You had your hand up? Yeah, number 1, and then we'll go in that direction.
I'm a little troubled by what I perceive as the vagueness of your question.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I understand it right, because free speech as such doesn't have purposes. Purposes must begin from a society that treats free speech or permits it or protects it for certain ends. And I think people are replying to what those ends are with that assumption of, is that what you mean by the question? Is that what is implied?
Yeah, and can you tell me your name?
Phil.
Phil. Yeah, so that this question, it's a very open-ended question, and I'm really trying to get the audience to say, it's a very vague question, says Phil, absolutely. And Phil, do you want to say anything else about, there actually is an answer, people, to this question. Nobody's given it to me yet. But I really want to hear like what the sort of background ideas are. Phil, did you want to put anything else on the?
No, we have someone else there.
Okay, so you, and I forgot your name.
Sheila.
Sheila.
So that the dominant powers are not the only ones that are heard.
Which is So Sheila, this idea, dominant powers are not the ones controlling the whole narrative, despite what Chuck said, right?
That's whether you can buy it or not.
Yeah, and really, this whole idea of dominant powers is key for free speech. And over there in the back, and then I'm not gonna say, oh, you guys didn't get it, because you all got it. But there is an interesting answer constitutionally to this question. And what is it?
It's Kathy, and it's a foundation to our democracy. We have a representative democracy. Our representatives who are elected locally, nationally, need to hear our points of view in order they can better govern.
I do have some little prizes over here. They're little comics about the Constitution, and you just won it. What is the purpose of free speech? It is to instruct our representatives about what they should do. And we don't use the word instruct in the US Constitution, but if you go through what the First Amendment says, that Congress shall make no law, and then we go through a whole sequence. Some people call it the life cycle of a citizen. That the first one is freedom of liberty, of religion. You get to have a conscience. That's something else I saw on one of your panels around here about how important the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. So first one, religious liberty is the right of the conscience. And then once you figure out what you're thinking, then you can say it. And then you can publish it through the press. And then you can assemble. And what's the whole point of assembling? To let the government know your grievances. So what is the purpose of free speech in a very specific constitutional way? It is to tell the representatives what they're doing wrong. And if they don't listen, what's your next, says Jill? If they don't listen, what's your next vote? And so I see you have both of those, the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. That's exactly the purpose of free speech. On a really narrow level, but that's how the Constitution sets it up. And let's see.
So,
Somewhere I have the Vermont Constitution. Oh yeah, here it is. So the Vermont Constitution says, this is, the Vermont Constitution is set up, they kind of have the Bill of Rights first, and then they get into more like functions of government. Let's actually bring this down. Article 20, so we might think of this, if it was a Bill of Rights, it would be the 20th Amendment, because they split up the Bill of Rights into 21 articles, that the people have a right to assemble together to consult for their common good, to instruct their representatives, and to apply to the legislature for redress of grievances, that's language we have in the First Amendment, by address, petition, or remonstrance. Remonstrance, that could be kind of impolite, uncivil. And so here in the Vermont Constitution, they say it with a little more detail than they give it in the actual Constitution. But that's its purpose. Now, that isn't to say everything else here is not absolutely right. Somebody said it's the foundation of our democracy. Did you say that too, Kathy?
I did.
Yeah. So it's like the foundation. We don't have it without it. But its purpose, the whole reason it's set up, is for us to complain when we feel the government hasn't done it correctly. And I can make that claim because the Constitution and the whole way we set it up is we the people. So where does the power come from? It doesn't come from God, as it might have come with divine rights of kings. It comes from us as a collective, and it's through that power that we let the government know when we think it's gotten it wrong. Okay, so thank you, Allison. This is my partner, Allison, who's being very thoughtful, because otherwise it might fall down. What do you think the purpose of hate speech is? Anybody want to say? And can you tell me your name?
Laura,
Laura.
hate speech, which could be defined differently depending on who you are, but hate speech is to silence people that you disagree with. Or think are doing something that you don't like.
To silence. Yeah. And can I put you on the spot? Was it Laura?
Yeah.
So Laura, is there something about it? I mean, a lot of people were nodding when you said that. And we're feeling like, yeah. So what is it about this idea that if someone's saying something you don't like, you want to silence them? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is there a reason why human beings, I know it may sound so like obvious, but people were like, when you said silence them, they're like, yeah. So what is it about, yeah?
Control.
Control. And can you tell me your name?
Julie.
Julie. Julie, what makes you think that control is part of that silencing?
Trying to disempower your opponent and empower the people who believe like you do, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, so it really
Trying
is.
to shape the society to the way you want it.
Wow, so it's even bigger than like, we just don't like you. It's really about control of society. That you're not part of our society, and so we're going to say something hateful so that you don't want to be part of this society.
Like go back to.
Yeah, go back to something of that sort. That you're not part of our team, so we're going to use hate speech in order to make sure you're not part of our team. Yeah, Kathy.
Self-aggrandizement.
Self-aggrandizement. You want to say more about that?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of says it all.
Kathy, do you wish to silence Marjorie Taylor Greene?
I bet I could find some helpers in there.
So this self-aggrandizement, so this is important. I know I made a little joke there, but why do you feel like that's such an important part of this? It's not just silencing. It's not just reshaping society. There's also very something individual, selfish about it. Do you want to add anything?
A way to power.
A way to power. Yeah. Yeah. And Jill.
To agitate.
Oh.
Yeah.
To
To get people worked up,
agitate.
either for you or against you. To provoke.
And what you're saying, Jill, gets back to Chuck's idea of this media industrial complex, the outrage machine or something of that sort. Yeah. Clark.
The question I always have is, who determines what is hate speech?
Oh.
And what is their agenda by labeling it hate speech? Yeah.
Clark, do you want to say a little bit more?
Yeah, I recall, like probably some of the greater guys in here, the young soldier in the 70s, I was called a baby killer and a murderer and so forth. And by the time I was no longer a young soldier, I was getting ready to end my military career, all of a sudden I was a hero and thank you for your service. So it's all agenda driven. I think that use of the term hate speech depends on your agenda.
Yes. So Clark, if we start to label something hate speech,
Correct.
then we should also be looking at ourselves.
It's used to invalidate arguments that you don't agree with or a position that you find unacceptable.
And Clark, I didn't pay you to come here, did I? We've never met before.
If you say so.
This idea that hate speech, to call something hate speech, is a way. Okay, so there's hate speech and the effect hate speech has on silencing. I don't want to dispute that. But there's the second level, the second order that Clark wants us to understand, which is that when you use that term, it's a great way to stop debate. Because you just said, okay, that's hate speech, therefore I don't have to hear it. Ooh, which is kind of like you don't have to hate speech is when you silence people you don't like. So there's an interesting little relationship going on here. Yes, and Tim? No,
Tom.
Tom.
Hate speech often embodies a threat. I think that's a key component.
Hate speech often involves, did you say?
Embodies.
Embodies a threat.
So I'm just writing down hate, a threat, or hate speech, and I'm putting it in quotations.
Can I ask Clark what he thinks about that?
Well, again, as I said, being an 18-year-old young man being accused of being a murderer and a baby killer, where was the threat? There's no threat there. It was plain slander and defamation of my service to this country.
Right.
So could there be implied threat? Yes.
Yeah.
The threat is, you say something I don't like, I'm gonna make you and the rest of the world turn against you.
Yeah.
I say using that term, hate speech, is a threat to invalidate and denigrate an individual.
Mm-hmm. And I want to, because I think we've got these two, this is like going to be the key issue, that when we start to go to the Supreme Court decision, this is exactly what they're trying to figure out. When certain kind of speech is clearly threatening, and this case that we're going to look at, RAV versus St. Paul, is clearly threatening behavior. And we could say, because it was threatening behavior, and we'll read what the ordinance looked like, that a reasonable person would assume that somebody who was from a certain population, because that's how they did it in St. Paul, that members of certain groups would reasonably feel threatened. So this was an African American family, and so they should reasonably feel threatened, and therefore it was a violation of the ordinance. So that is, you know, a way to approach this issue. And then there's this other thing to keep in mind, and which thank you, Clark, for bringing it to our attention, which is when we start making those claims, then it's harder to argue in your defense. Because it's sounding like it's criminal behavior, just even though it's words or actions, expression, it sounds like it's moving into criminal behavior, and therefore what could there possibly be the defense? Sheila.
There's an element of whether there's a system involved here, of whether I'm just saying something hateful to you because I don't like you or your position, or is it because you're a class that has societal consequences, and the hate speech is reinforcing that class inequity.
And this is, thank you, Sheila, because the term hate speech, when towns, cities, universities are trying to reduce it or ban it, they are most concerned about its effect on vulnerable populations or marginalized groups or the other kinds of terms. So that's a key piece when we're understanding, like, what do people mean when they say hate speech? And this is particularly true since the 90s. It has to do with nasty language about members of a certain group.
So I'm just going to write down marginalized groups. Maybe it'll stay now, Allison.
Until you get down here.
Okay. Okay. I want to have more hand up, so I'm going to find out.
Can you tell me your name? Eliza.
Like some of what gets called hate speech is basically people getting extremely angry and just kind of letting loose in public.
Yeah.
That component seems relevant.
So there's an element you could say with hate speech is that it's a type of speech that is out of control. That it's just that the person who's speaking is saying it in such a way that they've lost all reason or sense of propriety. Yeah.
Let me get that one down. So thank you, Allison. Out of control. Okay.
Nice. I got two more hands up. We'll go with Phil, and then I'll go here.
I disagree with my seatmate here.
Yeah.
Just because someone is out of control with a town, they may be upset that there are too many potholes in Carpenter Hill Road or something like that. They may object to that, but that's not hateful terms unless they call the road commissioner certain names. That's where they cross the line into hate. Otherwise, it is freedom of free expression.
Yeah. So maybe this one, I'm just going to say, I'm going to put a little thing under it.
different understandings of hate speech, which is important to know. If we begin to realize that we're using a word and we have very different understandings, then it could mean that we're going to run into trouble trying to understand one another. And I think Phil's point that if we think of hate speech as something that has to do with the emotional condition of the speaker, then that's going to be different than understanding hate speech as targeting a certain group. And then that could be less of an emotional issue and more of a strategic issue. And I had one other hand up, and I think Joy. Oh yeah, Joy. I remember you, yeah, because you had a background with Theodore Parker.
Yeah, getting back to the threat because we didn't really kind of, say more about that, but along with that, it seems to me that hate speech often involves perceiving a threat either to the status quo or protecting the status quo and creating a sense of chaos or confusion and doubt and mistrust. I mean, I think that's all involved there. And I don't know how to put this.
Well, and so Joy, you're saying like this has to do with, again, a strategic move to use hate speech in order to sow chaos? Not just to try and control a marginalized group. But what you're saying is another way of understanding hate speech. It's bomb throwing or anything to just sort of get people distrustful, angry, whatever. Like, yeah, or the former president, or yeah.
So the threat, I'm going to make a thing here. The threat can be on the level of an individual. It could also be on the level of a group, and then it could also be on the level of the situation. It doesn't look very good, but anyway, that's good.
Okay, so, and that these are the things, when we're worried about hate speech, we have reasons to be worried. And to remember what Clark said, we should be watching ourselves. When we start to use that word, are we also trying to stop debate? So it's a predicament. All right, let's turn to St. Paul, because it's a pretty clear decision, and it goes after some of these same concerns. So if you look at the very back, first of all, just to remind us what we're doing here. This is all coming out of the First Amendment, and that's where you get to see that life cycle of the citizen that I mentioned, that it starts with religion, free exercise thereof, speech, press, right of the people, to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there we've got our First Amendment, which sort of sets the stage. Now, St. Paul, if you open it up,
Where will we find copies?
oh, yeah.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, does anybody else need a copy? Oh, really, a lot. Once you get it, if you open it up, you will see what the St. Paul ordinance is. So that's just flipping it open, and you'll see it there. And this ordinance went into effect, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a pretty brand new ordinance by the time we look at the case. So let me read to you what the St. Paul ordinance says. Whoever places on public or private property a symbol or object, such as a burning cross or Nazi swastika, which one knows or has reasonable grounds to know, arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others, on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender, commits disorderly conduct. So it's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony, but it's a very specific misdemeanor. St. Paul also has no trespassing, disorderly conduct, etc., but this is a new anti-bias ordinance that they pass. And a couple of things to note. we had talked about how certain groups are often targets of hate speech, and so the way St. Paul identified that was on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. Not, anything missing from that list? I don't know, just that, what? Age.
Sexual orientation.
Age, sexual orientation, right. So nowadays, maybe there'd be more. Anything else?
Politics.
Politics, oh! Clark, would you be willing to say a little bit more?
Yeah, I lived through the 60s and early 70s, and people of certain political persuasions were routinely harassed and badgered because of those positions.
Yeah.
And again, free speech, yeah, you're perfectly fine to speak your mind and hold your political beliefs, but you shouldn't have to worry about being chased on the street by a mob and, physically threatened or having people outside of your home demanding you take certain political or judicial positions.
Right, right, exactly. So there's nothing here about if you happen to be a member of a political minority, like I would say, God help the Republicans of the state of Vermont. God help the Democrats of Florida right now. So, but there's nothing.
See, there's that line that always bothers me in this situation, is the inferences that people in this state who have a different political view than I should be looking over their shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
That's what needs to stop.
Right, right.
No one should feel that their political position places them at risk for any sorts of social, political, or criminal retribution by the majority.
Yeah.
And that, in my mind, isn't really hate speech, that's just plain wrong.
Yeah, nicely said. Right, that we, if we're really going to hold up to all that purpose of free speech, then we should be looking for different points of view.
Everybody wants diversity, but I've yet to hear a demand for diversity of thought.
Right. Yeah, okay, I am so happy, Clark, that you are here making this case, because this is where I thought I was going to have to push people, but it sounds like we've already had somebody who's lived through it and understands that why is it the protections only apply to people on race, color, creed, religion, or gender? Well, there's a simple answer, and that has to do with civil rights law, which set up equal protection based on race and then on gender, and has started to move from gender to sexual orientation. But there are protected categories under the law around discrimination. So St. Paul is not crazy to use this language, but that's kind of what was at. Clark, you had one more thing, and then we're going to move to the facts.
14th Amendment. Talk to us about it in the context of these kind of laws.
And so the 14th Amendment, the question about equal protection. Yeah.
Yeah, period, equal protection. Folks, in my mind, you start nitpicking. I'm a simple-minded guy. Equal protection under the law says everyone, period.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to say equal protection only applies to this group of people or that group of people, or these people are not entitled to it. So in my mind, again, why don't we focus on the 14th Amendment?
Yeah, and so Clark's question about the 14th Amendment, which applies to states and not to Congress, it is interesting that this case, they did not bring up the 14th Amendment. For this particular case, which happened in St. Paul, the question they have is, does this ordinance violate the First Amendment? So that was a strategy the lawyers chose. They could have chosen a different strategy, but for this particular case, they really wanted to say, how does free speech butt up against this kind of an ordinance? But before we get into what the justices said, setting the stage, what happens in St. Paul, Russell and Laura Jones and their children, they move into a St. Paul neighborhood, and when they wake up in the morning, they go out and they see a burning cross. I made a photograph, which is right above the St. Paul ordinance, to give you a sense of how big it was in relationship to Laura Jones's foot. So it's not an enormous cross, it's a little cross. And A 17-year-old neighbor, we don't know his name because when you're a juvenile under criminal court, we don't know the person's name. So the defendant who was charged, a teenager, he is charged with violating this anti-bias ordinance. He has some good lawyers, and they say, we're going to take this to the Supreme Court because we feel that this is a violation of the First Amendment. They could have done what Clark thought, which is let's go with equal protection. But for whatever reason, and maybe this has to do with the 90s, and a lot of interest in pornography, feminists are saying that words are violent, pornography is violence, and so there was a strong concern in the 90s about, do we still have First Amendment protections when certain progressive groups are making a case that words are violence? So because of that kind of political milieu, I think that is why they decided, okay, we're tired of hearing that the First Amendment does not protect certain kinds of speech, and we're going to use it in St. Paul and see what happens. So if we open it up, you can see who was on the court at that time. It's the bottom right-hand corner. And it's always worth, I think, reading some of the opinions, especially Antonin Scalia is a very good writer. He does have fabulous sentences. And he says, content discrimination is not permitted. Now, is it okay, Josh, if people don't have a mic and are just reading loud, we'll see what happens if it gets picked up. Would anybody be willing to read the first paragraph under Justice Scalia's opinion? Yes, thank you, Kathy.
Assuming, arguendo, that all of the expression reached by the ordinance is proscribable under the fighting words doctrine, we nonetheless conclude that the ordinance is facially unconstitutional in that it prohibits otherwise permitted speech solely on the basis of the subjects the speech addresses.
Yeah, and so thank you, Kathy, for that. The fighting words doctrine, and this gets a little bit to the threatening piece. There is a Supreme Court case, Chaplinsky, fighting words doctrine. I think I put it down at the very back of the pamphlet. Words which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. Some of those things you guys were talking about in terms of hate speech, that it leads to chaos, that is provocative, those are called fighting words and they have no First Amendment protection. So Scalia is reinforcing the notion that just because we have free speech doesn't mean you can say anything, but it is a pretty high bar. You just can't say, you can't make the fighting words out of necessarily burning a cross in front of the Joneses' road. So I'm just going to hold that out there. Burning a cross in front of the Joneses' house is not necessarily fighting words. So that's the first thing the Supreme Court says. And the second thing, somebody want to read the next paragraph? Yes, Jill.
St. Paul has no such authority to license one side of the debate to fight freestyle while requiring the other to follow Marquis of Queensberry rules.
Yeah, anybody know what the Marquis of Queensberry rules are in fighting? Boxing! Yes, boxing! So you can't say to one group, all right, you have to use the Marquis of Queensberry rules. You cannot make any threatening comments because all those people you're saying it to are in a protected category. And the other side that wants to go after, to follow Clark's example, wants to go after Republicans, you can do whatever the hell you want. You cannot make two kinds of laws. So that one type of hateful speech that's directed at one group of people is highly constrained, and another type of hateful speech towards another group is not constrained. You can't do that. You know, that maybe that's an equal protection, but Scalia just says you can't do that. Somebody want to give the third paragraph? Yes, thank you. Joy.
Let there be no mistake about our belief that burning a cross in someone's yard is reprehensible. But St. Paul has sufficient means at its disposal to prevent such behavior without adding the First Amendment to the fire.
Yeah. So what are these other possibilities? Remember, this is a 17-year-old kid does this. Could have gotten him on trespassing. Could have gotten him on disorderly conduct. Didn't need to use this bias. Yeah, Clark.
You know, it's interesting you cite this example because personally I've lived it. Both my mother and father were born in Mississippi during the Depression. So of course they knew all about terrible things that happened to people of color. Well, 3 of my father's 5 children were serving in the military overseas, and of course he served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Someone burned a cross on our front yard in a nice middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut. So needless to say, the politicians trotted out their apologies with the media behind them. And you know, the issue was they were looking to charge said person with arson, and of course trespassing, which is clearly a racial intimidation act. But you know, using this logic and the club you could wield under arson charges were a lot more harsh and significant for that 17-year-old than using what was, in my mind, reading this, an attempt to enforce social mores against a criminal act instead of trying to be socially correct. You should have gone after this person as what he was, a criminal.
And with a broad-based universal crime as opposed to a highly tailored crime. Yeah. So the Supreme Court voted the ordinance down. Right? Pretty clear from what Scalia says. He's writing the opinion. What do you think it was? 7-2, 5-4, 8-1. Any guesses? What? 9. You're right. 9-0. At that time, that was the understanding, is that if you were trying to tailor the law to go after certain kinds of talk, and it's based on what they now call content discrimination, that's not constitutional. And that is still the law of the land, which is why oftentimes when colleges start to try and impose speech codes, they run afoul of this. Because you cannot set things up so that laws apply to one group because of what they're saying to another group as opposed to a universal law. So that's where free speech is right now with respect to hate speech. You cannot, if you're a public entity, fine-tune something in order to, and Clark used the word create social norms, you cannot have the state enforce certain norms. Just can't be done. Yeah, and could you tell me your name?
Leslie.
Leslie.
My son goes to Berkeley, and last year and the year before, they stopped someone who was going to come to speak because, if I have this correct, they were concerned that it could get violent on campus. So is that different because it's on a college campus?
Well, are you talking about, there was one, what is his name, Yiannopoulos? I'm not saying it correctly though, Yiannopoulos? And students invited him, there was big riots in the streets. It's a public institution, and so the public institution had to be very, very cautious. They couldn't shut it down. My sense is they were walking a very tight line at that point. And the riots that happened, I think I can call them riots because there was a fair amount of property damage done in downtown Berkeley, that was what happened. Now, when this puts colleges in a difficult place, I mean, what just happened at Stanford Law School, where a judge from the Fifth Circuit is shouted down, and the students are not just doing, we don't want to hear this, the students are using what they call the heckler's veto and making it impossible for him to talk. I think Stanford did the right thing in saying, we can't do this. So now Stanford students, they have to do First Amendment training. That seemed like a good outcome, because there seemed to be very little understanding of First Amendment at Stanford Law School, as if they hadn't even read this case. And they didn't understand, the political theory behind why we have free speech, but also, this is a fairly significant case that says you can't do that. All right, so I want to shift it a little bit, because I know we're starting to move closer to the hour. This is very real on another level, and it gets to the notion where, yes, we have free speech in order to get together in public places. Gary, I mean, what do we have public meetings for? And so we can express our opinion and say why we think somebody else is wrong. And then we get to have a real tussle. But as things are getting heated up, there have been efforts to try and reduce incivility, is usually what it says, in public meetings. Jill, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm looking at this definition for fighting words, and I keep thinking about January 6th and what the president, former president, was saying to that group of people who he invited to the Capitol, to Washington. And I'm just thinking that that inciting, it says here, or tend to incite. How come that's not been brought up about what he said on January 6th? So I guess those terms.
Well, and this is like, when we have a term like fighting words, that means that a prosecutor is going to want to say that conduct constituted fighting words, which is going to be an argument for a prosecutor. And then you need a jury or a judge to say, was it or wasn't it? And can you make a direct causation? So, and this is a beautiful thing. Again, we're going to open up a democratic process or a judicial process to hear the different arguments.
So that was what the January 6th committee, the House committee investigation of the January 6th insurrection was doing, was trying to link the president to those fighting words and to inciting that riot.
And so we can say, that, so there was an impeachment, however, there wasn't a conviction.
Right.
And personally, I'm always for let the process play out, and that's a political process. Even though it did have judicial aspects, it was a political process. It went through the political body, and that's where it ended up. It's like, okay. But can we move, I'm going to move this, if we can, to more local, and then we can go back to this other question. Because boy, what a moment when we are looking at criminal charges and former presidents and that sort of thing. And believe me, I'm not going to weigh in and say I think somebody's guilty or innocent until an actual process goes through, and I feel better when the process makes its own determination, and I live with that process. But okay, so I'm going to bracket that, and I'm going to now move to the case of Southborough, Massachusetts, which was having a very difficult time at its public meetings, select board meetings. It felt like people were misbehaving, and so they passed an ordinance. All remarks and dialogue in public meetings must be respectful and courteous, free of rude, personal, or slanderous remarks. Inappropriate language and or shouting will not be tolerated. Is that going to pass muster with First Amendment reading? Kathy in the back is saying no. What are you thinking, Kathy?
It's not.
But on the other hand, it's treating everybody the same.
Oh, see, it is different.
It's everybody, no matter who you are, what you're saying, it's not content. It's just everybody's going to be under these same rules.
Yeah, so in terms of our RAV decision and how that was about content discrimination, there's no content discrimination in this, universally applied, all people. It has nothing to do with race, color, gender, etc. Yeah, Clark.
This is highly subjective in my mind because, as this gentleman mentioned, if there's something that is truly, truly eating at you, and you're emotionally bound up by the event, who am I to tell you your reactions or your communications are wrong and disrespectful?
Yeah, that's what Phil said. It's getting at the subjective issue that Phil brought up. Oh, like who's gonna judge if it's disrespectful or not? Yeah. Oh, no, I forgot your name. Does it begin with an L?
Eliza.
Eliza.
I might be stepping in here, but, I've worked in factories over the years, and, you know, I moved in middle class circles, I moved into not so middle class circles. The kind of language that people habitually use in their daily life varies drastically between the two. And basically, if you're telling people that they can't use swear words in a public meeting, you're telling a whole class of people that they can't speak the way that they're used to speaking.
So Eliza, you're bringing it, like, not only do we have the subjective issue of like who gets to determine whether or not you're out of control, but you're saying there's a whole class piece here, that if you start saying inappropriate language, you're speaking to one class of people and not including another class, yeah. So anyway, this goes to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Not to the US Supreme Court, this is two small potatoes, we don't have a First Amendment issue here. We do, but we're gonna have to go to the Massachusetts Constitution. So, Massachusetts Constitution, Article 19, the right to assemble in an orderly and peaceable manner to consult upon the common good. This sounds a lot like Vermont's. Give instructions to the people's representatives and to request of the government by way of addresses, petitions, or remonstrances, redress of the wrongs done them and of the grievances they suffer. So that's the language in the Massachusetts Constitution, quite a bit like the Vermont Constitution. What do you think? Did this civility code in Southborough, Massachusetts pass muster?
I would think so.
Who thinks so? Yeah.
I would think it.
Gary? Yeah, and why do you think so?
I think to have a civil action with a group. If somebody starts going otherwise, everybody's emotions go, and then all heck breaks loose. I think it's fair to ask people to be proper in their arguments and stuff, so I don't have to leave your emotions at the door. We're all adults, and we expect everybody that comes to the meeting to be an adult.
Yeah.
We just can't use the excuse that, oh, my emotions ran over me, and I just start getting to you, and you can't do that.
So there seems to be, I mean, this language from the
It's not asking the
Constitution.
law, and I think it goes with the law.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
not going against anybody's rights.
And they do say in order to have a peaceable and orderly meeting, so it makes it sound like that you could ask for that kind of civility, if you want to get the people's business done, they can't be screaming at each other.
I don't see any law that can do it.
Yeah, any other thoughts? Tom?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the definition of remonstrate.
Yeah, what are you thinking? Remonstrate, what is this word? It's a very strong word, isn't it? It's even maybe up there beyond grievance. Yeah. So, in fact, what happened in Massachusetts? It did not pass muster. This is what the Supreme Court Justice Kafker said. Although civility can and should be encouraged in political discourse, it cannot be required. According to our Constitution, political speech must remain uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Civility restraints on the content of speech at a public comment session in a public meeting are forbidden. You cannot tell people, chill out, when they're wanting to remonstrate. You have to be able to hear it. And it's a pretty amazing opinion. It's called Barron versus Southborough Select Board. He quotes John Adams. He quotes Samuel Adams. He quotes the sassy cheerleader case, which is one of my favorite First Amendment cases that just happened, where the cheerleader says on some social media and they want to throw her off the team, but no. So they quote that case. There's a lot of great quotes in this decision from the judge. And So he reverses the Superior Court judgment, and he also found that the board member who told the person they had to leave the meeting because they were acting inappropriately, that they did not have qualified immunity. Which means now that the select board member has to pay legal fees and who knows what else. So that was a big decision that just came down last month. Hot off the press, and people here in Vermont should pay attention to it because we have the same language in our Constitution. You can't do the civility code. Okay, so now Gary is probably feeling bummed right now.
I'm a little bit bummed.
Yeah.
Because if I disrupted this meeting here,
Mhm.
and I started acting really strange, what was the first thing you would do to me?
So,
You would make sure that I left, right? Would you have a right to make sure that you called the police and then I left?
Absolutely.
But you would do it, right?
well, how bad were you going to be, Gary? Because I do have a bunch of strategies I like to try. I mean, how bad was it going to go?
So you are trying, within reason, to have a civil meeting,
Yeah.
right? And if I was uncivil and throwing things around or using really rough language that you couldn't conduct the meeting, you would call the police, you'd have me evicted, right? You have a right to evict me, but I don't have a right to you know?
To hear, because we do want, I think one of our early people who was speaking about free speech, the right to hear.
That's right.
That other people have a right to hear.
So you have the right to evict me, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you're feeling nervous, aren't you, Gary? Because, I mean, in a sense, what the Supreme Court, what the Massachusetts Supreme Court just said is we cannot have a civility code.
But you're saying that I can't do it.
Oh, interesting. Clark wants to jump here, and I'm going to let Clark jump in.
There's two circumstances here. We're talking about a governmental, public legislative activity.
Yeah, select board
You're
meeting.
discussing a private gathering
Oh,
of
it's just
citizens.
because it's here, but I mean,
No,
say it wasn't.
But again, apples and oranges. I understand the Constitution, both Vermont, Massachusetts, and the United States give people the right to redress their grievances. Now, the worst example I think of is you go to a Southern Baptist revival versus a Roman Catholic mass. They're both worshiping the same God, but they're doing it a heck of a lot different way. And who am I to go in there and say, the way you demonstrate your faith is wrong, or the way you demonstrate your faith is better?
That's right.
I'm sitting in a public meeting, there's an event, a public issue that strikes me to my spirit, and I cut loose. Am I a bad person or am I doing wrong? No, I'm following the guidelines as written, undoubtedly, and the Constitution is appropriate for this entity. Now, I come into a private organization and they say, take a hike, Clark. Okay, fine, it's your property, it's your circumstances.
But the
I
fact that
believe.
it's a public meeting is going to be important. And Gary, I understand that you were just saying, okay, I'm coming up with a hypothetical in the moment. Yeah. Okay, and I'm hoping everybody is feeling a little bit like, okay, what do we get to do? Because sometimes public meetings go very, very badly. And what are we going to do? It's going to be horrible. Ha ha ha. What's the answer?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I'm wondering
That's
if
what they
you
do,
could put
right?
a time limit, if there can be a rule, that there's a time limit on how long anyone may speak. Because if the disruptive person takes over the meeting essentially, then no one else gets to have their own speech heard. And then the purpose of free speech is defeated.
Is defeated. Beautiful. What's your name?
Sue.
Sue, are you a town moderator?
I'm sorry?
Are you a town moderator?
No.
Okay. I brought my gavel and my Robert's Rules of Order. And so what do I do if somebody, you know, I have some rules that I say initially before we get started. Robert's Rules guides everything we do. We're going to do with our motions. You want to amend the motion, that's fine. We're going to go get a second on the amendment. We're going to go through this. It's going to be laborious, but it's going to be a whole lot of fun. And then I say things like, after you've spoken once on a particular article, I will not recognize you a second time unless everybody else has spoken. I'm pretty easy about time, but if somebody's going over 10 minutes, then I'll usually say, can you wrap this up? But that's a way to deal with this. Now, here's the thing, what if they don't? Ooh, it's very exciting. I get to say something like, Just to remind us, we are now discussing Article 3. Will the voters of the town of Putney apportion $1,100,000? What you are saying, can you make it germane? I want you to speak on this, and I know you're unhappy, but can you frame it in such a way that is germane to the article we are discussing? And if it starts going off onto some other thing, and believe me, in Putney, one thing I think we're talking about articles, and the next thing I know we're talking about politics in Washington, D.C. It's like, can you please reframe what you're saying and have it pertain to the article under discussion?
But what if they don't?
I haven't had to remove somebody, but I do have bad noises I make. Just like something to like move it around a little bit. Or something, anything to shift the energy. I will count it, and I don't want to minimize how bad things can get in meetings. They sometimes get really, really bad. And there's also let's all take a breath. Can we just take a breath? This is important business we're doing together. Remind people we're doing the people's business. This is what democracy is like. Yes, we may hate each other, but we might actually learn something or not, or we just have to listen to idiots. That's okay. We're going to move it to a vote eventually. So whatever to do that, to kind of shift the energy. But I think there are ways to deal with this problem without doing the civility code, which, as Clark mentions, who gets to decide what's appropriate and who doesn't? Oh, the moderator does, if you have a moderator. Yeah, hand in the back. What was it? Was it Chuck? No.
I guess my question is, when does it enter into disorderly conduct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would have to be pretty nasty, I would think.
Physical?
When you punch your neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, you don't. If somebody starts to hit somebody, I do think there's more de-escalation tactics available to us. And if we're not terrified, we can think of them. But when we go into our meetings and we think there's just going to be the worst thing in the world happening, then we start to get more nervous, and then we want civility codes. And so I guess, like my final little push is, go with Robert's Rules of Order. Don't worry about hate codes. Find civility through neutral terms that are very procedural, and develop a good sense of humor. So, yes.
Robert's Rules, that's not a constitution. That's not a law that you have to follow Robert's Rules.
It is under Vermont.
In Vermont, under what law is that?
So, oops, sorry. I didn't bring my parliamentarian with me. It is, and I can send it to Chuck, under Vermont statute, all public meetings must be run by Robert's Rules.
Okay, so that gives you as the moderator the power
Yes.
to put time limits, and you sound like a terrific moderator. I wish you were the moderator in Bennington. In my opinion, we have a moderator who is very different. I'm just trying to be nice because I don't want to be thrown out of this meeting. He's very, very different, and he shuts people down, really. And at least that's my opinion. And so, anyway, and he leans on Robert's Rules as if it's the Pope, as if he's the Pope and this is the rules. So it's how you use them, and you sound like you use them right, but the way you say it and the way you deal with it is very different, and it could be different in different towns. And I'm sure it's very different in different states that don't have town meetings.
Yeah.
If they have a city council, it's very different, than, in New York City or somewhere, Chicago. Very different.
I so appreciate you bringing this up, and I'm not trying to rat out other town moderators, but everybody in the town moderator works for the group. And a town moderator can say, I'm ruling on this, and the group can then say, the people don't like that ruling. Town moderators should say, can we hear somebody speak against this article? And really look for the opposition. And that's a problem I've seen before, where town moderators just want to hear one side, and they don't go looking for the opposition. That does not do a good thing for democracy. And we got to hear, why do we have free speech? Well, because we want to hear different points of view, or not. But we want to at least have that option. So I do think the people of Vermont have this great tradition, but they got to ask their town moderators to actually go with the spirit of what this is.
Yeah, it's really, that's right. It's the spirit of what this means to be. Well, also we have what do you call it, Australian ballot. So that puts most discussion to bed. You know, we don't have a lot of discussion anymore.
Yeah, and this is a very sad thing that we're watching going on in the state of Vermont. Here we have this amazing tradition. Again, this case out in Southborough, Massachusetts, they cite Tocqueville and others that one of the key habits that we have in New England is how to do free speech in a public setting. And if we just do things with Australian ballot, we're losing those habits. And then we might as well just call it a technocracy, because it's no longer a democracy. It's hard to, I'm reading from Justice Rugg and Wheelock v. Lowell, cited in this case, it just happened. It's hard to overestimate the historic significance and patriotic influence of the public meetings held in the towns of Massachusetts before and during the Revolution. No small part of the capacity for honest and efficient local government manifested by the people of this Commonwealth has been due to the training of citizens in the form of the town meeting. And that's what we're missing. So yeah, my final words are, if you've got Australian ballot, consider going back to town meeting, voting on the floor, and that we have to get a lot better at the habits of free speech, which means allowing people to say things that you may find are hateful even, and figuring out a better argument, and then making sure that these rules of procedure are followed. So anyway, I got one more question, and then I'll wrap it up because I know we've been going for a while. Yeah, Sheila.
What is the difference between prohibiting acts and prohibiting speech? And where an act like putting a cross on a lawn is considered speech rather than an act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what one of the things that people brought up about January 6th, this was just free speech.
Mm-hmm. Well, and elements of it were, until it crossed the line, then it broke a law. And then those laws were, I mean, Clark was saying the arson law was a pretty good law and had pretty serious consequences. Attacking police officers or breaking property, or, you know, there's quite, and there's over 1,000 people charged with pretty serious crimes. So, yes, and there were also people there who were demonstrating. And I guess we got to be able to see the difference and allow for those people to have their speech, because the other option is just, you know, trying to put them in jail. Like this 17-year-old, he did not go to jail on these charges. I'm going to say that was probably a good thing. There could have been other charges, and but to go to jail on those charges, personally, I'm not too happy. Anyway, thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience. I really appreciate coming to Bennington. Thank you, thank you.